Okay, so my name is Kris Kenyon, and this is the story of my life.
I am Joyce Kenyon, Kris's grandmother, and I was married to Don Kenyon. I was born October 11th, 1946 in Hyattsville, Maryland, and was raised by my parents during the Depression with very little money. My husband, Don Kenyon, was born in Springfield, Massachusetts, and raised there by a very religious family. And then he joined the Marine Corps when he graduated from high school and spent 6 months in Vietnam until he was wounded twice. And he was sent to Walter Reed Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. I was working at Boeing Aircraft, and a couple of us girls decided to give a Christmas party to any of the wounded veterans that could not go home from Christmas. So we contacted Walter Reed Hospital and we set everything up. And the night that the boys arrived, I met my husband, Don. He would come down and visit me in Hyattsville, Maryland, and I would go to Springfield, Mass. To visit him. And one time I flew up to Springfield, Mass., and my plane was delayed. And when I got there, I expected to find Don had been drinking, but he was very sober, and I wanted to go get a drink. And he said, no, we've got to leave. And the reason we left was because he had a diamond ring waiting for me in the car. And we got engaged at the Hartford Airport parking lot. And we were married on November 22nd, 1969 at Foster Memorial Church in Springfield, Mass. Don and I had moved to Plimpton, Mass. And had been married pretty close to 10 years and had not had any children. And we decided to adopt. And so we went to the Protestant Social Service Agencies, and they put us through counseling and stuff for adopted parents. And we soon met Stephanie and Lauren because we did not want an infant. We wanted an already family. And so Stephanie was 3 and Lauren was 5 when we adopted them. Kris's mom is Lauren. At the time he was born, she was 17 years old. At 17, she moved from the shore to Strasburg, Virginia, and that is where she met
My dad, and the way she met my dad was through, well, my aunt now, but my dad's older sister. According to the story from my dad's side of the family, is that my mom and my dad's sister were doing drugs, and that's how my mom met my dad, and then I was conceived, After my mom, got pregnant, I guess, see, the stories are conflicting, but she went back to the Eastern Shore to my grandparents' house, and the reason for that, after putting, different stories together, the reason for that is essentially it sounds like she was either in some trouble with drugs or she owed my dad's side of the family, some money that she had borrowed, gotten in trouble. Either way, she decided to come back.
The day she arrived, she took a pregnancy test, and we found out she was pregnant. And I honestly was pushing for her to have an abortion because she was not in a good place, had not been in a good place for a number of years. And she got mad and she left the house, and she hooked up with a friend that she had, and she moved in with her and spent her whole pregnancy with that woman. The woman she was living with while she was pregnant, they had a fire in their house. Lauren was up on the second floor, and she said the dog barking woke her up. And they all left the house and had to move into a trailer at that point.
Okay, so July 4th, 1994 is when all of this chaos started, and if you don't know what I mean right now, you're going to pretty soon.
On July 4th, 1994, Kris was born, and my husband Don and my youngest daughter Stephanie went to the hospital to see him, but I did not go. When Lauren and Kris got discharged from the hospital, she moved back in with the woman she was living with, and she hooked up with an old high school friend, and they started dating, and they got married. And I do not know the date of that. This is the first picture of Kris taken at 7 months old when he was living with Lauren and her new husband in Painter, Virginia. When Kris was a year and a half old, I got a call from Lauren from Children's Hospital in Virginia Beach that Kris had fractured his elbow and was going to need surgery, and she was going to have him in the hospital for 2 days and then going back home with her and Billy.
This is also one of these stories that's kind of conflicting, but the story that's generally accepted is that I was either A, on the top of a bunk bed, or B, climbing up a halfway put together bunk bed, and nobody was paying attention, and I fell. That's the generally accepted story. There is also other stories and rumors that it was because I was, crying, and so I got my arm slammed in a door on purpose, and there's been all kinds of rumors and theories. I don't know. The generally accepted one, though, is that I fell from a bunk bed and ended up needing to have surgery.
After Kris returned from the hospital, Don and I wanted to see him and spend some time with him. So I got up with Lauren and said, let's take him on weekends. And she and Billy were happy to have time alone. We would go down and pick Kris up on Friday night and take him back on Sunday. One Sunday, Stephanie was home from college and visiting us, and she volunteered to take Kris back to Lauren's. And then she called us after she returned him, and she was frantic that we needed to permanently get him out of there because things were bad at the house. I got a call from Lauren. She was crying and said she and Kris needed to move back home with us. And so Don and I talked about it and agreed that Kris needed to be someplace safe. So I told Lauren she and Kris were welcome to come home. When Lauren and Kris first moved in, everything was very quiet. Kris seemed very happy, and Lauren was told she had to get a job.
Okay, and this is going to be another one of those stories that doesn't exactly make sense, but this is the story. So, my grandmother ended up having to have surgery, and my grandfather was watching me at the house in Onancock. My mom was supposedly at work at Wendy's. Now, this is where it gets weird. My grandfather left the house to tell my mom that he could not watch me and that she had to watch me because he was going to the hospital to visit my grandmother. So, the first part that doesn't make sense is, where was I at this point in time? There is no answer for it. The second part is that when he found out my mom never worked at that Wendy's, they never heard of her, he didn't go back to the house, so that means I must not have been with him already, okay? Now, I wasn't with my mom because they didn't know where she was. He goes to the hospital. He leaves the hospital, and that's when they find me in the garage. So, if we recap, there's a lot of holes in the story, and that's really all I have.
She told us she was working at Wendy's. But then I got very sick and ended up in the hospital in Virginia Beach. And one day, Kris was home with Don because I was in the hospital, and Don had to take off and go see me at the hospital. So he went by Wendy's to tell Lauren to go home and take care of Kris. And when he walked into Wendy's, he found out she wasn't working. And I don't know whether he called a neighbor or what happened, but he ended up at the hospital seeing me, and he was in a very angry mood but wouldn't tell me why. And then he left and he went home to Onancock and found Kris. Kris had been left in the garage. He was like just a little over, like a year and a half old. When I was home from the hospital, the arguments started with Lauren because she had to get a job. And she did eventually find a job in a local restaurant in Onancock. And she started work. And Lauren had no car of her own, so we would take her to work and we would pick her up. And occasionally a friend that she worked as a waitress at the restaurant would bring her home for us. And then Lauren started going out on weekends after work with her friend Sarah, and she would tell me they were going line dancing, but I never believed that. When Lauren was going out with her friends, she started coming home later and later every night. And one time she didn't come home till 2 in the morning, and Kris had woke up at 1 and was crying. This is a picture of Kris's second birthday party. I had made him the cake and put a little boat and a fisherman on it because he loved Don's boat. And it was me, Don, Kris, and my youngest daughter, Stephanie, at the party. And he has a smile on his face, so I'm sure he was happy. One weekend, Don and I decided, since Lauren goes away on weekends, we were going to take Kris to Ocean City, Maryland. So we went. We had a wonderful time. We went to the beach. We walked up and down the boardwalk, and we introduced Kris to the best French fries at Thrasher's French Fries, and he seemed to really love them. And we had a wonderful time, and we went home, and Lauren never returned. After Kris was 2, we had had no contact from Lauren. She had never called or come by. And we ended up hiring a private investigator so we could find out where she was and what was going on. So I ended up calling social services again and asking them what to do. And a woman came out to see me. And we talked about getting custody of Kris. And she said to file legal documents. So we did. And it was a bit of a process, and it took 3-4 months before we got heard by the judge. And so Lauren came, and she decided to give up custody to Kris. She was not fighting it anymore, and we were awarded sole custody. On Christmas 1996, Don and I were very excited about Kris seeing his Christmas because he apparently, we got the impression from him anyway, that he did not have any idea what Christmas meant. And that morning, I could not wait for him to come down, but he didn't, so I had to go upstairs and wake him up. And I carried him downstairs to the tree and his presents, and his eyes lit up. And he seemed very pleased with everything he got. So 3 months later, Lauren decided to file for sole custody again. And we went to court, and the judge ordered that custody was ours, but she could have 1 weekend a month.
Yeah, see, these are things that I didn't actually know.
Her first visit came, and she seemed to be on time and pleasant, and she picked up Kris, and they went to her then boyfriend's house, Daniel. But when Sunday rolled around, she called us, and Lauren called us and was refusing to return Kris. And I told her I could call the police because it's against the sole custody. So we got Daniel's address somehow, I don't remember how, and we drove down to his house. And she brought Kris out when we got there, and Kris was crying. And he got in our truck, and we left instantly. We did not want to speak to her. After that visit, we never heard anything from Lauren for like 3 months before she called. And she said, I'm going to come up there, but I can't take Kris for the weekend. And she arrived, but she only sat in the garage. And Kris came out and saw her for a minute, but seemed of no interest. And then he went back in the house to play. And she stayed, had no explanation for why she was not returned Kris and what was going on. No explanation. And then she just left, and we never saw her again after that. The year Kris was 3, we had not heard anything from Lauren. And that summer, Don and I and Kris traveled up to Massachusetts to visit Don's parents at their summer place on Little Alum Lake. And this is a picture of Kris, who loved just pushing this dock in and out, in and out, in and out, over and over again. We had a hard time getting him out of the water. He had a good time.
So Little Alum Lake. That's one of those places that, like, I really have weird memories and feelings for. Because, okay, so I had some, like, really good times. I have really good childhood memories there, but I also have really bad childhood memories there. And so, yeah, I mean, at this point, I love that place, but now when I look back,
Don's family up north is a large one. There is his parents, he has 2 brothers, 2 sister-in-laws, and numerous, beyond count, cousins, nephews, nieces, and everything. And they are a very religious family, and this is their home, their summer home out at Little Alum Lake in Brimfield, Mass. And they live in Springfield, Mass. When we got home from the lake and Kris and I are outside and playing in the yard, one of the
things that she liked to do was she would get down on the ground, like on her hands and knees, and act like she was a horse. And I would get onto her back and ride her like a horse, okay? And one day I fell off and hit the elbow that I'd already had surgery on. And I don't remember a lot of details, but I specifically remember when my arm connected to the back of her heel, and the pain was pretty rough. I do remember that. But it wasn't, like, super bad. I've definitely experienced worse.
But the doctor said it wasn't broken. It was just like a little bone from the previous fracture had splintered off. Don and I decided to send Kris to preschool. And on the first day, I took him. I think I was more nervous than he was. And the teacher walks out to greet you every time. She just sort of leaned over and took him gently into her arms, because she did say to me at the time, the teacher told me at the time, the first day is the hardest. But apparently I left. He never cried, and he went in. Kris and his best friend Derek used to do a lot together. We used to take Derek a lot of places whenever we went somewhere. But one day, when we were going to pick up Derek, Kris all of a sudden says to me, "Did you know Derek is brown?" And I chuckled because I didn't know Kris had noticed even the difference. Christmas of 1997 was the first Christmas Kris knew what it meant, and there were presents downstairs. And Don and I had gotten him a small bicycle with training wheels. And he was excited at first, and we took it right outside. He didn't care what the other presents were. He wanted the bike.
I got a bike. That's what I had wanted, was a bike, but it had training wheels on it. And the only thing I really remember was hating the training wheels. I can remember the bike sitting in the living room by the tree and stuff. And it was a red bike, which I didn't want a red bike, but that's fine. I didn't get the color I wanted. I got red. But moral of the story is I got this bike and it had training wheels on it, and I hated that. I didn't want the training wheels. And I had to basically beg to get them off.
And he's like, no. He got mad. He goes, I don't want, and he kept pointing down at those training wheels. He didn't want them anymore. And I looked at Don, and Don said, nope, that's not going to work. He needs them. And he kept insisting, so they were taken off. And he went on the bike, pedaling, falling down, pedaling, falling down, pedaling, falling down for like 15 minutes. And then he got up and pedaled fine. And he looked at Don and said, I'm fine. The summer, Kris was getting ready to turn 4. He loved the boat. And he would either go stand out on the dock or sit in the boat and wait for his grandfather, Don, to come across the bridge on the way home so that they could go out on the boat. Well, one day, unfortunately, Don liked to drink, and he and Kris went out on the boat, and they made it out there fine. I think they were okay, but when they were coming back in and Don was trying to get under the bridge to get to our dock, he ran into the bridge, and he had to back up and park over there. And Kris, age 3, getting ready to turn 4, drove the boat perfectly and landed it at the dock. And then, Kris became the designated driver of the boat because of Don's drinking problem. But they still had fun. Kris loved driving the boat.
Okay, yes, this is true. I was driving the boat. I was the designated driver of the boat before I was 4 years old. And by the time I was 4 years old, I was the permanent designated driver of the boat. And yes, my grandfather was an alcoholic. He used to get off work, he would go to the bar, get drunk, drive home 40 minutes drunk, and continue to drink, and we'd go out on the boat. In the summer anyway, when it was warm. And so we went out on the boat one time as normal. He continued to drink as normal. On the way home, he hit the bridge. Now, he had to park the boat that night at the Oniancock Harbor, and the next day go get it. And from that point forward is how I ended up driving the boat and becoming the designated driver, because he was too drunk to drive, literally. But yet, he would drive home 40 minutes on the road down the highway.
Halloween 1998, Kris and Derek went trick-or-treating. And Derek is black, and we were walking around the neighborhood, had no problem until we got to this one house.
We were having a good time, okay? But the neighborhood that we lived in, not Derek, but we lived in, was a all-white neighborhood. And so we get to this one lady's house, and she comes out, and me and Derek, I think, I don't remember Derek thinking anything weird, but from my recollection of it is the woman came out and she was like, "What are you doing here?" And I didn't take it weird. I thought she meant "What are you doing here?" Because we're dressed up trick-or-treating. I thought it was supposed to be funny. Obviously, looking back on it now, It definitely wasn't, you know, that's just the neighborhood, and that's like the whole county. That's the whole county I grew up in. That's just what it was like.
And Derek's mom and I had been walking them around, and we were appalled. And so we continued to take them trick-or-treating and not make a big deal of it with them. And I hope Derek was okay when he got home with his mom. This is a picture of Kris on the last day of preschool. The school had requested that they wear these dress-up clothes. Kris hated it. He did not want the tie, the shirt, the shoes, the long pants, a belt, or anything. And he hated the school because they wanted it. He hated me at this time, and he hated his grandfather at this time.
I still don't like the fact that this picture exists, honestly. I hated this. I hated the tie. I still hate ties. I hated the button up in the collar. And I still hate button ups with collars. The pants and the shoes, just everything about it, I hated it. And it's like, looking back on it, okay, I understand why they wanted us to dress that way. But this should have been a first sign. Definitely should have been, if not the first one they noticed, right? But yeah, I hated it. They basically wanted us to dress up as little businessmen, and that's not fucking me. That's never been me.